The United States' rivalry in space with the Soviet Union can be traced back to the late 1950s. Tension was high and the space race was coming to an end. From this war emerged an effort towards cooperation, the Apollo Soyuz Test Project. The Apollo Soyuz Test Project, or ASTP, was a huge step for both the United States and the Soviet Union. Their rivalry had lasted for years, standing strong as each nation accomplished their own goals in space. The Soviet Union had succeeded in launching the first artificial satellite, living thing, and man into space. The United States had been the first to land on the surface of the moon. While the test project was crucial for cooperation, there was not always a desire for it. Before the ASTP came into view, the space race was alive between the two world superpowers. The Soviet Union had initiated the race on October 4, 1957, with the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. The Americans followed suit with their own satellite, named Explorer 1, only months later. This battle progressed toward the first moon landing, a feat each nation wanted to accomplish first. When the Apollo 11 crew stepped onto the moon on July 20, 1969, the space race wound down. Tension remained, however, some believed cooperation was the best way to dispel the unease and move forward with exploration. ASTP was suggested by NASA Administrator Thomas O. Paine, who suggested the idea to the Soviet Academy of Sciences by 1970. The concept was also discussed by NASA's Robert C. Siemens Jr., NASA's Deputy Administrator, and Mstislav V. Keldysh, the head of exploration at the Soviet Academy of Sciences. These events led to the creation of agreements, treaties, and plans for the upcoming period of détente that would soon ensure peace. In an interview with Dr. Jeffrey Mauck, another point of origin for the project was brought up.
Apollo Soyuz is really a product in many ways of the end of the Vietnam War.
In the late 1960s, the United States received word that the Soviet Union was building up a supply of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. This concerned the United States, and acting upon this concern, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the ABM defense system being constructed in Moscow. He then called the first SALT meeting, where he spoke with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin at Glassboro State College in New Jersey. President Nixon started the official SALT talks in Helsinki, Finland, on November 17, 1969. These talks verified the treaty. On May 26, 1972, President Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed the ABM and SALT treaties in Moscow. These treaties limited the number of missiles allowed in the arsenals, the number of interceptors, and the number of missile defense sites that each nation could have. By limiting such dangers, détente ensued and cooperation work was feasible. Trained for the ASTP, astronauts and cosmonauts had to work for the mission and for their foreign counterparts. The Apollo crew consisted of Commander Thomas P. Stafford, Vance Brand, and Donald K. Slayton. The Soviet crew was Commander Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov. One of the major tasks to be accomplished was learning the other language. Communicating effectively would prevent additional difficulties. The Apollo astronauts had a woman from the State Department and professors teaching them Russian. The Soviet cosmonauts had their own private English professors at all times. In these ways, each crew learned the other's language. The teams did regular training activities while visiting other training facilities. For the ASTP, the delegations and crews traveled to the other country for 5 to 6 weeks several times. In an interview with Professor Asif Siddiqui from Fordham University, the reason for these visits is explained. In his words, they had to develop a sense of trust about each other's motives. They had to learn each other's work cultures. They had to accept the way each other worked. An American delegation traveled to Moscow in 1972, where they toured museums, looked at housing, and discussed mission plans. Training in the Soviet Union took place in Star City. Everything was monitored or listened into by the KGB. A Soviet delegation came to Houston in July of 1973 to receive a tour of NASA's facilities and to look at Apollo simulators and training areas. The delegations used the language of their hosts to keep communication smooth. In addition, information about communication, craft design, and flight patterns was exchanged. Preparation lasted 4 years in total. The purpose of the Apollo Soyuz Test Project was to test safety procedures that would be used in case of emergency in other missions. It was also to prove that performing a rendezvous in space was possible. There was another purpose of the mission, one that was not so obscure as the others. This was to prove that cooperation was feasible, beneficial, and that the other world superpower was not the monster the public perceived it to be. Apollo and Soyuz spacecrafts launched at different times on July 15, 1975. The Apollo launched in the Saturn 1B rocket at 3:50 p.m. from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The docking module was stored in Saturn 1B. 7 hours earlier, at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Central Asia, the Soyuz 19 craft launched towards orbit. The Apollo launch was watched by a large crowd of spectators, including NASA Administrator James Fletcher and Soviet Ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. July 17, 1975, 2 days after launch, when the Apollo had gotten into an elliptical orbit, the Apollo and Soyuz crafts docked at 12:10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. With the docking module piloted by Donald Clayton, the two craft came together. Finally, at 3:17, the hatches between the Soyuz and Apollo were opened. The commanders Alexei Leonov and Thomas Stafford came forward and shook hands. This was a symbolic end to the space race.
Здравствуйте.
Got it? It'll stay open.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
Alexa. Glad to see you. Here.
Здравствуйте, Алексей. Очень рад видеть вас.
Очень рад. Это роща день. Советский Союз, Соединенных Штатов.
In the spacecraft, the crews did cooperation work and everyday things together. The first night of being docked, the two crews had a meal together. They then exchanged commemorative items such as plaques, patches, and tree seeds. That night, both crews stayed up later than scheduled to fix minor errors with their spacecraft. The next day, Vance Brand stayed in the Soyuz with Valery Kubasov, while Alexei Leonov went into the Apollo with Thomas Stafford. After eating, Leonov and Stafford went into the Soyuz, and Kubasov stayed in Apollo with Brand and Slayton. While doing their joint activities and experiments, the crews broadcasted to Earth tours of the spacecraft. There were several congratulatory messages that were directed towards the crews. The Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and United States President Gerald Ford both called the crews to offer their congratulations. In addition, United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim gave his praise for the work done. He is appreciative of the effort put towards peace and cooperation in space. The world greatly responded to the mission. The launches were watched heavily, and the broadcasts from the craft, such as spacecraft tours, gave information to the public.
Let me call to express my very great admiration for your hard work, your total dedication in preparing for this first joint flight.
It's taken us many years to open this door to useful cooperation in space between our two countries. And I'm confident that the day is not far off when space missions made possible
by this first joint effort will be more or less commonplace.
The work of the mission had been completed. The craft undocked at 8:02 a.m. on July 19. Following this, there was another practice docking, which ended with the final undocking at 11:26 a.m. The Apollo crew stayed in space for an extra 3 days. In this time, they performed onboard experiments. The Soyuz 19 craft landed in the Soviet Union on July 21st at 6:48 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Apollo 18 craft followed suit. At 5:18 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 24th, the craft splashed down into the Pacific Ocean and was recovered by the USS New Orleans. Several effects that the ASTP had on the world around it. Despite the lack of congeniality among the nations after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan on December 26, 1979, the mission ultimately led to many future successes. In Professor Siddiqi's words, just the fact that the two countries had been able to successfully cooperate at the height of the Cold War served as a big vote of confidence that such space projects could be undertaken again in the post-Cold War 90s. The Shuttle Mir program, also between the United States and Soviet Union, was a result of the work done with Apollo Soyuz. In addition to this, the ASTP showed the world that a rendezvous is possible. Today there have been several missions that have involved the rendezvous maneuver, and the technique has been improved since the ASTP. Dr. Jeffrey Mauck shared his perspective in our interview.
The important thing is it did show them that cooperation in space was possible and productive, and I think that's probably the best thing you could say.
Apollo Soyuz Test Project is relevant to this year's History Day theme, as it shows how past exploration led to cooperation and joint exploration on a topic that would benefit all space travelers. What occurred in space was the encounter between the Americans and the Soviets on friendly terrain. The exchange of information allowed for proper communication between the Americans and the Soviets, as well as a new perspective of the other culture. The crews also exchanged commemorative items while in orbit. Together, these aspects made a mission that changed space cooperation and work for the future.